Thank you, Satish. Organizers of Girmit commemoration event, my fellow panelists, respected participants in today's function. Now, I've got a whole PowerPoint here, but having a look at the time constraint, I might not go through all of that. I was specifically asked to speak on socio-economic issues facing descendants of Girmitians in New South Wales and strategies to address them. Before I go any further, just want to put something in context. I think as we highlight the issues that we are facing, it's more in the context of raising people's awareness of Girmitians and within individual homes as well, so that anybody and everybody is able to have that understanding as to why I'm facing something. Now, if you look globally and if you look holistically, the issues that we are facing is nothing compared to the issues that the world is facing. There's so many other issues. Now, it does not, we should not feel that, all right, there's drugs going on everywhere, there's social issues going on everywhere. If anything, I think one thing, a dominant thing that will come forward later on is the fact that people from Fiji are quite resilient. But I wish to start off by saying, or just a quick introduction to myself. I was born in Fiji and I grew up in Fiji, but I'm not a Fijian. I'm an Indian, but I was neither born nor did I grow up in India. I'm legally an Australian, but I was neither born nor brought up in Australia. So guess, who am I? I don't know. Maybe a day will come when I'd be able to figure out, and maybe everybody else will figure out who we are. Now that leads me to the first issue that I was going to talk about. And it's not an issue that's identical, unique to Fiji, people from Fiji or descendants of Girmitians. It's an issue that everybody faces, but then we go a step ahead because we've been a fairly fragmented society in the sense that before we had a chance to take root in one country, we actually got moved to another. So when we talk about identity, there are three specific types of identity that anybody would be concerned with. First one is the individual identity. At some point in time, everybody goes ahead and tries to find out who am I in the global context or in the context of my family and so forth. The second one is the social identity, which is what group is it that you're going to align yourself with. And the third one is the cultural identity. And I guess it's the cultural identity that a lot of people from Fiji here in New South Wales are trying to establish. Now, the reason why I'm saying that these are really important issues is because, I'll go to that particular slide. It's because the difference that happened to the descendants of Girmitians once they moved to different countries. I must stress that after the coups that started in 1987, people realized that Fiji wasn't really the place for them, because the land that they thought was theirs was no longer theirs. The home that they had built and spent so much time building up was no longer theirs. So they realized that, well, it's time for us to move on because this is really not the place for us. Now, before that time, during the era of Girmitians, there were a few common things that was happening to everybody that was there. There was oppression by coolie masters, as you have heard. There was struggle for food, clothing, shelter. There was isolation from family, and everybody was a laborer. So the entire group that came from India, they were the same. They lived in the same kind of houses. They all had lost their families back in India and so forth. And therefore, a very strong community identity was formed. Now you'd know, and if you spoke to people, they would say we had Jahaji Bhais. That was a term that became very commonly known. And in fact, people from my generation, they still carry on those relationships. Unfortunately, what happened was, as people moved from Fiji to New Zealand, Canada, US, and so forth, there was this, they found themselves in these developed nations. And these developed nations had issues of themselves. Now, I wouldn't actually go ahead and say there were issues, but the lifestyle was different. And therefore, people from Fiji had to find themselves in this multicultural society. So they had to then start thinking, all right, when I was in Fiji, there were only Fijians, the native Fijians, and there were us. But now we've got so many different cultures, so many different religions. My God, I'm going to get lost in that. So that was an overwhelming feeling that anybody would have. And I'm pretty sure it would be the same with so many other cases. Then there was this issue of realigning themselves, their educational level with the demands of the society in Australia, meeting social obligations of families and their own parents, great-grandparents, and so forth, having an economically viable living, and then raising families that will carry on their identity. Now, the socio-economic cost of descendants of Girmitias, I've written some points there, tradition and culture. Now, there is a really, really important issue that I see. Once people moved to these countries, that was the first time that they got a chance to stand alongside people from India. I've got friends, lots of friends from India. And we try and get along very well, but there is a sort of alienation there. I don't know if people have realized that or not, but there is an alienation. And the reason is because we've missed out during that period, and the generations that came forward, we've missed out on quite a few things. And therefore, the way I speak, I've got my very close friends, Mukesh Bhai and Mamta and everybody here, and there's a number of other families that will be here. I speak to them, we get along very well, but there's a language difference. I've missed out on the Indian calendar that goes on in India, all the cultures, all the traditions, and all of those things, the Vedic knowledge, the Sanskrit language, Yoga Vidya, meditation, spirituality, numerous religious historical texts. We never had access to any of those. The classical music, dance, and other forms of art, Fiji Indians never had access to that. The food, the different types of food that's available, and the food habits. Most Indians in India were vegetarians. All right, so at the moment there is that alienation due to all of those factors. And I see those as issues or things that we need to focus on. There are some other issues that I would very briefly like to highlight. Now, you must have heard about your own friends and families. I'm going to attend somebody's wedding in New Zealand or Canada, or I'm going to attend a birthday there, or somebody's remains are being flown over to Fiji, and all of those issues, the number of trips we make back and forth. This is because our families are scattered all over the world. Now, the families are scattered, but we haven't lost ties. We still love them and we care about them. My personal story is my brother lives in Canada. Over the last 25 years, I've made multiple trips. That's at my own expense. And we've said really heartbreaking goodbyes. What will happen when I'm no longer able to travel, when he can't travel? So these are the issues that I think that we are facing. Now, I was also supposed to highlight some solutions. I don't see our problems as being unique, but one of the things that I've written here, and I suppose I wrote that when I was, focusing all my attention on the issues. Well, if the UK government did this, they should take responsibility for some of the things that are happening. So that was my mind frame then, until I read heard the documentary about Rohingyas yesterday, and I said, what am I talking about? Look at what they are going through. Anyway, government initiated dialogue between religious and cultural groups. I think there needs to be dialogue between Indians, descendants of Girmitias as well as Indians, so that there's a better understanding and they can actually see the reasons why and how they ended up in Fiji and what the differences are. There should be programs developed to support the different descendants so that they have an equal opportunity. Now, you must have seen that one of the slides had the Maslow's hierarchy of needs on it. Not that we are not able to reach the highermost, but I think the issues that we are facing has a lot to do with the food, clothing, shelter, and also with the love and all of that, the fragmentation that has happened in our society. So that's why I'm saying that we should have that support so that we are able to move along the hierarchy of needs on the full 5 and 6 scales instead of limiting ourselves to the bottom. And the most important, I think, is the dialogue within each family so that each individual family knows the heritage and culture. And I know that Ashika is here with her 3 children, and that is one of her motivation to be here, because as a parent, she feels responsible that, yes, what am I going to tell my children? And that is the attitude. If that persisted in every family, I'm sure we'd go a long way. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rai, must call Bhabiji. You have brought out so many issues, and I'm glad that you have done that. They need discussion, and if we feel, those who have gathered, that we need further discussions, IDCA would facilitate that, a day-long conference, or maybe a couple of days of conference, no matter how long it takes. If the conference, decides that we need to discuss the issues which Bhabiji has highlighted, and we'll do that. And I'm sure when we listen to the next speaker, Asha Ramzan, the reason I'm not introducing the speakers, because I have been doing that on the Facebook for so many weeks now, and there's a little discussion over here, so people, and like Bhabiji has done that, perhaps Asha can introduce herself as well, briefly. No, I think you'll have to. And whilst that's being done, can I request one of the younger ones to get some water or even a cup of chai for the panelists, because I think they're dry in the mouth. Thank you, Asha.
Can you hear me? Oh, great. Yes, I'm Asha Ramzan. It's been lovely to hear the stories and think of my childhood growing up in Suva. So I went to Dudley High School, which was mentioned in your little paper that I just had a quick look at, Dr. Som. So I'm going to talk about women Girmitias and their legacy for us, Fiji Indian women in the diaspora. Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Darug people. For me, it's really important that we acknowledge that we also are on the land of people who've been colonized and dispossessed, and we have that in common. And my organization works with the Aboriginal community, and at times it feels like we have much in common. When we are sitting and yarning, I feel very strongly connected to some of their stories. The stories we've heard about our Girmitia ancestors, both men and women, is full of hardship and great suffering. There's stories of fear, abuse, violence, exploitation and deprivation, and the loss of human dignity and sense of self being less than okay, that's associated with the dehumanizing experiences of indentured laboring of Girmit. Girmit replaced slavery. It's a form of slavery. We need to actually acknowledge what that means, because it's an obfuscation. It's actually a lie to say that it was anything other than a form of slavery. You were tied to the actual place that you were farming, and you couldn't, and I've been reading about the fact that you could have the most unjust of overseers, but you would not find the support of the system to leave if you wanted to. And this is particularly the case for our female ancestors. Two of the well-documented stories of our Girmitia ancestors, Kunti and Nairani, highlight the lack of safeguards for the well-being and safety of women during Girmit. And their stories bring to light the precarious nature of their existence within an already brutal system of forced labor under the colonial rulers of Fiji. Perhaps what's most striking for me as I think of the experience of my Girmit ancestors is the resilience and strength of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers. Because not only did they endure and survive, they managed to rear children in the most adverse conditions, and eventually they were instrumental in our people dragging themselves out of abject poverty and oppression to make a new life in Fiji. And I say that because I look at the role that my mother had in our lives, and I look at the other women that I knew growing up, and they were the glue that actually held families together. They created family and they dreamt big. They brought their dreams for a better life for their children, their hopes and dreams, and their grandchildren into reality. And as I said, I know this to be true because these were the stories I grew up with. My mother's father, my Nana, was a 14-year-old Girmitia. The age was actually fabricated to be 18 so that he could be taken to Fiji by his uncle. I grew up with these stories, and these are the dreams my mother wove into the lives of my brothers and sisters. Our existence today, our presence here, bears testimony to the hopes and dreams of our grandparents and great-grandparents and our grandmothers and great-grandmothers. We are the descendants and the inheritors of the dreams of our Girmitia ancestors. My question is, how do we integrate these truths and the powerful narratives of our ancestors as we create new identities as Fiji Indians in Australia? And I'm really grateful for Puspa for actually creating the perfect segue for this kind of discussion. The difficult issues are in my court. So we are people twice dispossessed. Can we take the stories of survival, courage, strength, conviction, resilience, and determination of our Girmitia ancestors and use them to tackle the issues facing our community today? A community has not had the courage to acknowledge the social ills and problems we face. Sometimes I ask myself, do I have a skewed view of community because I work with problems and I work with social ills? But then people tell me, actually, no. Those things exist, but nobody wants to talk about them. I've worked as a domestic violence counsellor, a child sexual assault counsellor for 25 years, and then in community capacity building, working with communities from the Pakistani background, from Indian background, all kinds of communities. And what I'm really struck by is the absence of the Fiji Indian community in the things that we put on and the things that we do, and I'm quite excited to be here. These include issues like domestic and family violence, child abuse and neglect, poverty and unemployment, and sexual abuse and exploitation of children and adolescents. It also includes forced marriage. It includes marital breakdown, and it includes fragmentation from each other in terms of even our spiritual and religious connections. I hear that we have so many temples. We're a small community. Why do we have so many temples and mosques? I'm curious. Doesn't that split our community further and further? Can we not work together and find tools to resolve issues that come up instead of breaking away again? And then there's problems related to drugs and alcohol. These are not unique to our community, by the way, but what strikes me is there's actually a silence. Not only have we not acknowledged the existence of these problems, some of us have been complicit in the denial of them existing in our families, in our neighborhoods, and in our places of worship. We've been part of the conspiracy of silence and the sweeping under the carpet of things that make us uncomfortable and ashamed. And some of those things are shameful. But then there are also things that we can work with. Other communities have had the courage to take them on. And perhaps what's worse is that some of us have participated in the gossip and the blaming of the victims. I know this because of my work as a counsellor with families, young people, children, women, men, as well as a community worker, and my lived experience as a Fiji Indian woman. What I also know is these problems may have been denied and kept hidden, but they haven't gone away. And we've had some very public cases in the recent years that have exposed the truth of our problems and the depth of community neglect, apathy, and perhaps what's most difficult to face, a lack of care and regard for each other's humanity. And there was the case of the young woman who wandered through the streets of Liverpool and eventually died. And I was relatively new back to Sydney when it was brought to my attention, and somebody said to me from the Department of Community Services, "Isn't that somebody from your community? Why didn't you know about this?" And I said, "I am truly sorry. I am a little bit disconnected from my own community after 25 years in Newcastle. I'm also a product of a mixed marriage, so I belong in no camp. I don't have religious affiliations with the community, but I have a deep cultural and love affiliation with my community." There's enough research and body of evidence at our fingertips now about the impact of domestic and family violence on victims, who are mostly women and children. Yes, there are male victims, but they are mostly women and children. The most recent research has focused on the impact that it has on children, on babies and their brain development and their health. The adverse impact on our children and young people is actually really disturbing, and it will impact on them in their future well-being and happiness. And that, from my perspective, is alarming. I suppose what I'm here to invite you to do today is to think about family violence and those other social problems from your lived experience, because if it was my lived experience, I imagine it may have been yours as well. And ask yourself how it has impacted on you, on your family, on your community. And if this concerns you when you look at your own families and the Fiji Indian community generally, I want to ask you if you're willing to accept this for future generations. Because don't ask yourself why your children don't want to identify as Fiji Indian when we've actually neglected their basic needs for inclusion, happiness, respect, care, and safety. And is this what you want for your children and grandchildren? And if you don't, are you willing to be part of the solution? You're not alone. Other communities are tackling this, and we're working with them. It's quite exciting. My organisation, Sydney Community Forum, works with migrant and other community groups in St George and the Inner West. And the community-owned solutions strategies that have come out of the people that we work with, people stepping up and saying they want to address the difficult issues in the community, and they will use cultural knowledges and strengths to address them. And it's really fabulous work to do. And they've begun to make a difference in their own community. And I'd like it if my own community had the courage to do that. And my organisation is happy to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. That was very bold, I would say, speaking to our community, throwing up a challenge, which I hope our request, which our community perhaps would or would not take on. I've been trying to do that for the last 20 years without much success. Hopefully after this conference we'll get some response. As you talked about women, let me talk about the three women you have mentioned. Naraini. Naraini's death, she died in Fiji after she was mistreated and mistrialed in Fiji, and she went mental and she never returned home. Kunti was one of the boldest women, Girmit women we know about. She resisted the sexual advances of the Columbar She survived. She jumped into the river, survived. And perhaps nobody knows over here that Kunti did return to India in 1914, and she joined with her family and joined the abolition movement, and through which we are celebrating today the abolition. And she was part of that. She stayed in 56 Harrison Road in Calcutta, and she joined the movement there. And the third person you mentioned is Monica Chetty. A lot of people knew about her. Acknowledge Harish Prasad sitting over there. He probably knows about the story as well. Many people in Liverpool knew about her, our community, but hardly anybody lifted a finger to do anything to her, and acid was thrown on her. And then she was living in a forest in Preston area, and then a woman heard her cries, and she was sent to hospital where she never recovered and died a few days later. Raivision Film made a film on her, short film, Please Help Me, because that's all she said to people. She was burnt and scarred, and she would say, please help me. Time, day after day, week after week, month after month, but none of our community members provided her support, and we are all to blame. I think we have come to...
Can I just give you a quote from Arundhati Roy?
Yes, please.
You would know Arundhati Roy. She's a writer. I read many of her books. God of Small Things, Indian activist, one of my heroes. She says another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. This is what she says about Indian women. So, you all have mothers and sisters and daughters. You are related to women in one way or another. You are all born of women. And it's important that you actually stand up and do something about the women in your community before there's further fragmentation.
Thank you.
So I would like to now invite Ashika Kumar, and she is going to be talking about youth and Girmit, I think. Most of the Girmitians were youth, many teenagers, how Girmit legacy can empower youth today and persuade them to address the issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name's Ashika Kumar. Some of you may know my father, Rajendra Kumar, and my mother, Geeta Kumar. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here tonight, but I'm here and I'm very honoured that I was asked to speak. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Dorag people, as my colleague Asha in the first session also acknowledged in her speech. So, as I said, when I was asked to speak here today about Girmit, I was very honoured and I was very humbled. And soon after, I was a little worried. Why worried? Because I realised my knowledge on the subject was somewhat limited. Of course, I understood that my ancestors had been brought from India to work in Fiji on sugar plantations, and that they had signed an agreement to do so. Agreement. A foreign word in Indian mouths. Soon that became Girmit. And so these people subject to that agreement became known as Girmitias. Well, at least in our Fiji. And perhaps that was the beginning of our unique Fijian Indian language. I knew, of course, also that the Girmitia had been tricked, and that most, if not all of these people, had no idea they were being sent far from their homes, across the seas, to what was then uncultivated lands, to work for years and for little pay. I knew also that they had suffered many hardships. They were often treated cruelly and made to work very long hours. I knew also that although some had returned to India, many had stayed in Fiji, and that these were my direct ancestors. And from the labours of those people, schools developed, children were educated, and slowly, by little steps, which turned over time into giant leaps, the nation of Fiji prospered. But how did I know these things? I knew some of them as if through osmosis, through storings and mutterings I'd heard my parents, my aunts, my uncles, and my grandparents speak. And I'm sure many Fijian Indian children learnt this way too. But I did not learn these things in school. To my knowledge, Girmit history was not a feature of subjects of school in Fiji. I do not know if that's changed today. Perhaps it should. But even if I'd heard my elders speak about Girmit, that's my little boy speaking, by the way, I did not know the half of it. Perhaps they wanted to spare their children their tales of their hardship and suffering. Perhaps they were ashamed, even though they were blameless and had no reason to be. Perhaps they wanted to focus on the future and not the sorry, dark tales of the past. So, what I now know about Girmit, I have learnt as an adult, from reading books compiled by people who have dedicated their time and researched the subject. The other panellists spoke of some of those books, and there are many more. And by attending events similar to this that celebrate us Girmit heritage. And I'm indebted to the work of people who are present here today, including my uncle Satish Rai, who have been promoting awareness of Girmit issues and stories so that we can be informed and have knowledge of what our ancestors endured. I myself have 3 children. They're all present here tonight. For those of you who don't know, my husband is of Italian descent. So my children, naturally, have links to Italy. Now, Italy. Italy is a cool country. For kids, it's a country of pizza, pasta, gelato, and of course, the Ferrari. So you can see, it's very easy for my children to acknowledge their Italian heritage. But when it comes to their mother's heritage, they are rightly confused. I think my aunt, Puspa Rai, pointed out really well. I was born in Fiji, but I'm not a Fijian. My eldest son, Christian, asked me last year, "But Mummy, how come you are Indian, but born in Fiji?" So of course I had to explain it to him. And then it occurred to me, for my children, who do not reside in Fiji, yet have Girmit history, there is very little by way of resources to educate them about the Girmit years. There's plenty for adults, there's nothing for children that I know of. They do not have the benefit of learning by osmosis, by being immersed in the culture of Fiji Indian life like I did. They do not see the land that was fields where our ancestors worked. They do not hear their stories like I did. And try as I might, I simply can't recreate that here in Australia. It's a different lifestyle altogether, as my cousin has pointed out. So what tools do we use to teach our children about these things? What are the usual tools we use to teach our children? The teachers here amongst us, and I'm sure there's many, like my aunt Puspa Rai, would probably agree that for very young children, we teach through songs, we teach through rhymes, and we teach through books. And as I said, to my knowledge, there are no children's books about the Girmit experience or the indentured experience at all. Again, perhaps that is because we have felt that we want to spare our children these tales, that these are not stories for children to hear. But I think that does them and us a disservice. The Girmit story shouldn't just be confined to history books for adults. We sometimes forget how curious our children can be, how willing to learn, how eager to know, and also we forget how resilient and empathetic they can be. So if there are no children's books, perhaps there should be. And if it occurred to me then that if others have not gone on to create such books, perhaps I should. So that is the task I've set myself and announcing publicly. Hopefully I'll accomplish it, not only for my children, but for all the generations of Girmit children to come, wherever they may reside. Finally, I started my speech here today by paying respects to the traditional Indigenous owners of the land. Those people were displaced too, but here today we remember and honour them. Similarly, our ancestors were displaced from their homes, and today we remember and honour them, and rightly so. Thank you very much.